Welcome, and thank you so much for joining. I think we're going to get started, and everyone else can join a little bit later. Otherwise, I don't want to keep all of you guys waiting. So for those of you that don't know who I am or haven't seen any of the other ones that we've done so far, I'm Agnes Hamilton. I run Pelican Arts Rev with Ben. And these are our monthly webinar series where we're covering a range of different topics that can help with your child's instrumental learning. So tonight's topic is quite a hot topic when learning an instrument. So I'm hoping we can help in a few ways. I'm going to do a presentation on the topics that I set out in the invitation and then answer any questions at the end. We're joined by our amazing teacher, Andy, who's been teaching with me for many, many years. And we're gonna have a chat at the end about common things that teachers think with practicing and busting some myths and all useful things like that. And then at the end, we're going to answer any questions that you guys have. If you think of questions throughout the presentation, just drop your question into the chat with a Q at the front, and Fiona's going to monitor them and try and put them some together. If there are lots of the same question, we'll put them together and we'll hopefully answer them all together. So yeah, let's get going. So what is practice? Okay, so this might seem like quite an obvious question to start off with, but I think it's a commonly misunderstood concept that often we as teachers and musicians assume is something that's super understood and it's really in our language. So that's something that I just want to address. Practice is a method to solidify what students have learnt during their lesson. It's a daily task similar to homework, which improves and hones the techniques and tasks of learning an instrument. So honestly, practice never really ends. It's something that as musicians we're still doing. I still do, Andy still does. All my teachers probably will still tell you that they still practice their instrument. And that doesn't mean that they all love practicing their instrument. It's just a sort of daily necessity to keep ourselves going. It's a bit like exercise. Practice usually comprises of a set of tasks set out by the teachers which have been covered during the lesson. So that might be a few scales that they've learned, a new key signature, a little bit on their piece. It's usually broken down into a few different sections of things that they covered during the lesson that they want to be worked on during the week and solidified into everything that they're doing. The aim is to recreate what has been covered in the lesson and do it regularly throughout the week until the next lesson to make sure that that is understood and everything's there. Having taught for over a decade and sent a number of children off to music college and scholarships and playing to a high level, honestly, I don't believe in innate talent. Parents will often come up to me at a concert and say, "Oh, your student is so talented, they're amazing, I wish my child was as talented." It's got nothing to do with talent. 90% of the time it's to do with practice, and it really is. That is the difference that I see in students. So I can't impress enough how important practice is if you want your child to achieve. Other than having a great teacher, I would say it's the number one component. Okay, so is practice important? Yes, practice is really important. It's not possible to improve on an instrument without practice, however incredible the teacher is. You might experience some slight progress at the beginning, slow progress if you're doing nothing. You might see bit by bit getting a little bit better if they're having those regular lessons, but that will plateau at a level very quickly without any work between lessons. They'll generally get to a certain level and it's pretty much impossible to get further after that point. So practice is super, super important. An easy analogy made is that practice equals homework. So it's the same thing. However, I think from experience that this is too simplistic. Homework is often a singular piece of work, which once completed doesn't need to be looked at until it's handed in. But practice doesn't really fall into this category. The best way that I can explain the importance of practice and the importance it plays in learning is this. So if you have a child has their maths lesson on a Monday, and in that maths lesson, they might learn how to do their times tables for the first time. And they might even be sent home with some homework that is supporting that lesson, covers some of the topics that they did. However, then they go in on Tuesday and they have their maths lesson and they cover what was done on Monday. And they do that for the rest of the week. And maybe they introduce other subjects as well, but they're going to keep coming back to practicing their timetables until it's fully ingrained in a child's head. And music is no different. And often it's viewed completely differently, but it's exactly the same as learning any skill in school. The hard thing about learning an instrument is that generally you only get 20 to 30 minutes time with the teacher and the rest is up to you. So if you flip it back, if you imagine that your child only covered times tables for 20 to 30 minutes per week and then left it and forgot it about it for the rest of the time, do you think that they would feel confident in their timetables and learn their times tables and be able to confidently use them and improve on them? Probably not. So it is really simple, really similar, and I really encourage parents to try and put it into other things that their children are learning in school. And remember, the contact time that you have with the teacher is just so minimal that continuing that through the week is really imperative to make sure that you can get some results. It's also key to the enjoyment of music and the freedom of music. That doesn't mean that you have to enjoy practice, but only by feeling confident with what you are learning and achieving will your child start to enjoy music and get the full benefit from it. Without it, it can be a struggle, and sometimes then a negative association with music develops, which is not what we want. I really, really can't stress enough the children that are enjoying the music the most are the ones that feel like they come into a lesson and they're prepared and they feel confident in it, and then a teacher feels that, and then they get that identity through being confident in it. And that absolutely comes down to practice and the regularity of it. So that brings me on to, should my child like practice? No. And I can't stress that enough. So many times over the years, I've received emails from parents stopping lessons because their child loves their lessons, that they don't want to practice, so they must not enjoy it. So that, they're not going to, if they don't want to practice, they're not going to do it. But I think one of the biggest myths is that if a child enjoys their violin, they'll take themselves off to do it themselves and they'll go under their own steam and, they'll say, please, can I practice my instrument? But what I'd say is, again, take it back into other contexts of things that your child does. So when was the last time that your child begged to do their homework instead of playing on their iPad? If that doesn't mean that they hate school, it just means they don't really like working on the things that aren't as fun as performing or having their lesson or interacting. It's not as fun, but it makes it fun. So always put those things in the same category. Don't associate it with the love of the instrument. It's a very different thing. I never wanted to practice. I'll ask Andy at the end of this, but I never wanted to practice at all. But I also never wanted to give up my instruments. It was absolutely my identity. It was something that I achieved as. And as a child, I didn't understand that my parents making practice a non-negotiable part of my routine was why I was good at the instrument, but by proxy why I loved it, because that was the skill that set me apart. So I didn't understand that that's why that those were connected, but now I massively understand it, obviously, and see it. And without practice, I wouldn't have had that skill that set me apart and made me feel confident, and has led to me being able to use music in the way that a lot of parents actually want their children to be able to use music, not necessarily as a profession, but as a way to express themselves, a way to have that ease of playing, and in later life be able to play with other people and have a community around it in all the ways that music does. You don't have to want to be a professional to get those things, but you do have to practice to get that freedom and to be able to take advantage of that love of music and on all those things. Most children are going to need a nudge. I think I've talked about this a lot with my teachers over the years, and very few of them will say that they took themselves off all the time and did all their practice and absolutely loved it, or even now don't need a nudge from themselves to say, I better do something. It's not it's the same with anything, you know, it's self-discipline, and a lot of children are going to need that helping hand in the same way as homework or anything else. So a really, really common question that I get asked is, I'm not a musician, I'm not musical, how do I help? I don't know, it means nothing to me, I don't know how to help. And honestly, if we're doing our job correctly, it shouldn't matter at all. You don't need to be musical. All you need to be, you just need to be there to be able to support them. The best way to support practice is just being there and helping your child go through what has been covered in the practice diary, in the practice book, what's been said by the teacher. Just simply by reading the notes written by the teacher will often jog the memory of the child. They'll suddenly go, oh yeah, I remember that. And equally, you know, obviously I really encourage all my teachers to write in their most perfect handwriting, but everyone has different handwriting, and sometimes children can't read their teacher's handwriting. So even just by sitting and reading it through and helping them understand what the teacher might have said is going to really be it's going to help them really engage with that practice and feel like they're being supported with it. At the beginning stages of learning an instrument as well, just sitting and playing their instrument and playing a few things that the teachers might have said, even if you don't know if it's right, even if it doesn't sound like anything to you, it will help enormously for the child to feel confident with what they're doing. It'll help them feel like they're getting into a routine, literally just by playing it through and giving it a go is actually teaching the skills of practice, and the teacher can do the rest of the job as they're in the actual lessons. And also right at the beginning stages, you know, if you are interested, a lot of these, you'll find that you learn a lot of these things going along with them. A lot of them are not super complicated concepts, and they're broken down in really simple steps. And if you do need help, your teacher is super crucial in this. Any of my teachers are delighted when parents want to be involved and ask them questions and say, I don't know how, I don't really know what you mean by fingering in this passage, what does that mean? And then a teacher can explain, oh well, it means which finger you use to press which note. And no one is going to begrudge saying that to anybody, especially if, you know, it's helping out their student, because that also helps the lesson and makes everything much more joined up. I would honestly say the students that make the most improvement are often the ones where their parents has an active line of communication with the teacher, and I think all my teachers would agree, whether that be literally just by writing notes in the student's practice diary every week, asking a question saying they did really well at this but they struggled at this, or what did you mean by that? Just even that small amount makes a vast amount of difference in the results that you'll get from the lessons. Dropping them an email, anything like that. Teachers are super open. I mean, obviously at the moment we can't invite you into lessons, that it just can't happen, but when these things are allowed again, we're always more than open to have parents in lessons. If you want, you know, if there's a bit that you're really struggling to understand, write to your teacher and say, would you mind if I just came into the lesson and watched this bit so that I can understand it and help at home? All our teachers are going to be absolutely open to that. So how long should we practice for? And I think this is a sort of how long is a piece of string type of answer, but I'm going to try and break it down. It really depends on the situation. But there are a few kind of very general things that I can give you. But again, I would really encourage you to talk to your teacher if they have specific guides dependent on what their level is. The most important thing, which everybody would say, is regularity is key. 5-10-minute practices a week is 1,000 times more effective than one 40-minute practice just before their lesson. I would always take that over a long practice. In an ideal world, daily is the golden standard. You know, that no one's going to pretend that isn't the golden standard. However, but for many children, that's really, really tough at the start. It was really tough for me. For many children, it's really tough, and I know how lots of things going on. So I would aim for 4 to 5 practices with some set days off. So make sure that you fix those set days, get a routine in place, and make sure that the day off isn't the day before their lesson, because that's less helpful. When you start off learning an instrument, as I've said before, the most important thing that you can do to support your child is to put practice into the home routine. So when they start off, even if that just means 10 minutes, literally 10 minutes at a set time after or before school, it will set the normality of practice into learning an instrument. Doesn't even have to be great practice, but if it happens at a certain time after school, and it always happens, that will just start to embed itself into normality, and it will just be so much less of a battle if you can get it there at the beginning. Also, just by doing literally these 10 minutes a day, the teacher will see results. I don't know a teacher that doesn't see the result, can't tell when a child hasn't practiced, even if, you know, they haven't done all the right things. What often happens with a child that is regularly practicing, or a child that suddenly practices, is they'll come into their next lesson and they'll be like, I did this, I can't do that, but I did this. And that's really great. Even if they haven't done everything, it means that they're so confident about that all the other stuff is almost fine, because we can work on that, but they've really made an effort with this, and we can just tell. It will just be really obvious, and it leads to such a positive cycle because it allows teachers to be really positive. It's the same as a class teacher. You know, if a child comes in and everyone's done their homework but someone hasn't, that teacher's not going to be able to go, well done for not doing your homework. Even if they want to have a positive experience, it's really hard to spin that in a positive way. And equally, if they do, it just makes that positive cycle so much easier, even if they're struggling, even if it hasn't, you know, made huge amounts of difference. It just is so much easier to put that into a positive spin. And also it means that when a child doesn't practice, like if they have a really tough week, or they're ill, or they've just, you know, it's a one-off and you've had loads of things where you've gone out, it really enables the teacher to be okay with that, because they know in general they're practicing and they're really consistent. So actually having a week where it hasn't happened that much, as long as they come in and say, you know what, it was really, really tough and I couldn't do it this week, they're going to give them a pass, and they're going to still be able to be positive because they've got that trust that it's in routine, they've got an open line of communication, they understand, and the circle keeps going. As a really generalized kind of thing, I would say obviously 10 minutes a day from a beginner, getting them started. When you start working towards your first grade, I would try to aim for between 20 and 30 minutes, mainly because if any of you were at the last month's webinar on grades, we talked about kind of what that involves, and if you didn't manage to catch it, you can look on our website, it's all up there, the whole webinar is there, so you can watch that again. But in grades, and to take grades, there are lots of different parts to what they have to learn. So there's sight reading, and there's scales, and there's 3 different pieces. So just the sheer volume of things that need to be worked on means that those practices are going to need to be that little bit longer for them to keep all those balls in the air while they're preparing. And equally, on a really, really generalized level, I would encourage increasing that between 5 and 10 minutes per exam level. Once you get to around grade 7, 6, 7, you're probably more towards the hour mark. But under that, we're certainly not, you know, between 20 and 45 minutes as you're getting towards that grade 6, 7 level. And equally, you know, Andy and I, I'm sure we'll talk about some kind of tips of how to break that up and ways in which to make that a little bit more manageable. So that's a very kind of generalized, how long should I practice? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite Andy to come and join our conversation, and we're just going to have a bit of a chat. I'm going to take some notes so that when I add this up to the website, I'll sort of summarize what we chatted about. So hi Andy.
How are you?
So you've taught for me for what, 7+ years we've been working
more,
together?
I think. Yeah.
So we've seen a lot of students come through our doors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what would you say? what would you say some of the biggest practice myths that over the years you've kind of learned to bust?
It's funny when you asked me to kind of come onto this, there was three that kind of came into my head straight away, and you have covered them to the point. And I think the one that I always kind of trips me up is the self-motivation thing. And the self-motivation thing is a constant one that there's an equivocation made, I think, by a lot of parents that if children enjoy something, they will motivate themselves to do something. And it's hard. I think it's a lot more subtle than that, if I'm honest. Because motivation, like anything, I think it ebbs and flows. And you can have children who, when they start something because it's new and it's fresh, they can be so motivated to sit down and play, but then to actually practice and to be specific about practice, they're not that motivated, because practice by its very nature is repetitive. It needs to be, because you're, as you said, you're trying to reinforce these things. You're trying to reinforce something specific. So to reinforce it, it really means you have to play it 5, 6, 10 times. And that can get boring. I mean, and it gets boring whether you're, a beginner, grade 1, grade 7, grade 8. I mean, today, when you have to do these repetitions and you're not getting it right, it gets frustrating, and you can really feel like you're banging your head against a wall. So I think, just to understand, that motivation does come and go. I've seen kids who, once they have a great exam result or they played a really good performance or something, they suddenly, for the next couple of weeks, they're highly motivated, because they're living off that kind of excitement, how good they felt that they got up and did something and they got an achievement and a reward for that. And then it can ebb. It just, they come up against a passage in a piece that kind of becomes hard. And you can see it almost within a week or 2 weeks. It kind of meander a little bit,
Yeah.
And I think
and the avoidance of those difficult bits starts to creep in, of the play the bits that I really like, and then maybe just later, or
Yeah, absolutely. And then the thing of just playing through the same thing constantly, like from start to finish, and as you said, glossing over things, and just
I think that's also a really good point, actually. Sorry to interrupt, which I think is something that is really important to explain to parents as well, is that practice can also be, I don't want to be dramatic, but it can also be dangerous in some respects, because if you do practice, if you do just play the same thing again and again, and if you hear your child just starting at the start of their piece, playing it through, making a mistake, going back to the beginning, playing it through, making a mistake, going back to the beginning, playing it through, making a mistake, what they're actually doing is practicing in the mistake. So they're making it harder and harder and harder to ever undo that mistake, because it becomes so ingrained that that's what happens at that point. And I think that's one of those tips that I would really, really encourage parents to get good at, is identifying where those problem parts are. You can probably hear it yourself, but I guarantee you the teacher will probably have put in the book, bar 21 to 31 needs more work, or and I remember when I was a student, I don't know if you had this, Andy, but when I was a student, my teacher used to say, you have to play it the number of years you are old in a row until it's correct. So, because it kind of tallies with how much you can stand as a child. So if you're 6, you have to play that passage correctly 6 times in a row. And if you play it wrong on time 5, you go back to the beginning and you have to play it 6 times in a row. And if you can play it 6 times in a row, then you're probably likely to get it right that time. And then you get a reward. I think reward is also a really good part of it. I think parents are really able to do that. We're obviously not really able to do that except for in positive encouragement for children, but parents can really introduce that as part of practice, I think. I mean, I don't know, any other kind of tips that you have for that, sort of getting those bits that aren't as popular right, Andy, but
I don't know. I think a lot of the time I remember with my own parents, because my parents are, well, like, they're not musicians, or they're not musical in that. I mean, my mom's tone deaf, and I always think it's quite interesting, because there's myself and my sister in my family, which Agnes, and we're both professional musicians, and neither of my parents have studied music on A level. But what they were really good at doing my mom was particularly good at making sure we had a routine and
Yeah.
practice. As soon as we started it, that was it. You just piano got put into our day, guitar got put into my day. It was like, do this. Well, you do it, but you got to do it. You've got to make sure that you're practicing then. And I remember like she'd be kind of either in the kitchen doing something or whatever. And if I stopped playing for any length of time, she'd be in and asking me, "What are you doing
Yeah.
now? What are you practicing? What are you playing?" And then she'd make me show her what it was I was doing. And a couple of times a week, um, I'd have to maybe play for them and see, and just so they could listen and see what it is I've been doing. Now the thing is, I mean, I might as well have been playing anything. They didn't
Yeah.
know, but the thing is, just the fact that I felt I was accountable at some point, that my practice would be questioned, I kind of always made me kind of want to do it, and just kind of, and then they used to be fierce happy with generally what I'd done, the fact that I'd shown that I was trying to do something, and so I kind of got something out of that as well, and invariably that kept me going.
I
And
think,
God knows, actually, for the beginning in particular, I think it was really important.
yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's actually quite, in a weird way, similar but different to me. But I think that accountability is a really strong thing to take home from it. It doesn't mean you have to literally sit in the practice room with them, but having that kind of knowledge that it's at a set time and people are aware of what you're doing makes you a lot more accountable, and you get that feedback. I mean, my mum was actually a violin teacher, and so I had a different kind of setup, but my dad wasn't musical in that sense, but actually I would credit my dad in the long run for being the person that was the most involved in my musical journey. And because he was so involved in my practice, and he became so, he would listen, and he'd kind of hear it not from a sort of technical point like my mum, but from this more kind of broadly musical point. And also it just meant that I developed a very strong relationship with my dad that I associated with music that is actually really rewarding as a child. And I always, I really wanted my dad to hear my performances and be proud of it, even though my mum was the musical one. And I think music can really actually help those sort of, a lot of children end up kind of associating it with that, just that concentrated attention time with a parent, that even if they're not in the room, they're kind of still involved in it. And actually it can be a really, really positive thing for children to get that kind of feedback of that work and reward, and knowing that someone is involved and invested and listening, and can be a really encouraging thing as well.
Absolutely.
How do you try to help children understand practice? So, when you first when you have a kid come for their first lessons, I mean, you've started some kids off this term, I presume.
Yeah.
How do you kind of try to explain it to them,
I suppose the first thing you try and get across to them is the necessity to just make sure that they do little and often. I think that's, like, again, what you said, like, it's much more beneficial to be doing a small, even if it's 5 minutes a day of doing something that has happened. Because otherwise, a lot of the time I hear things like, "Oh, we practice at the weekend." That's a one I've heard over the years.
Yeah.
Is they have a lesson on a Tuesday, and the first time that they're looking at this material then is on Saturday, and you think of all that time that has elapsed on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, where they haven't thought about this stuff. So actually, in a really weird way, they're almost back at square one by the time they come to Saturday. So you don't really know what they'd be doing on Saturday, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And then sometimes they're spending 20 minutes at it, and realistically, you're like, well, that's going to be very frustrating, because this is new information to begin with. If you're leaving it till Saturday, it's going to be pretty hazy by the Saturday, and then they're being forced to play it for 20 minutes because they want to make sure that they're practicing. It becomes like a more arduous thing. And as I say to people, it's much harder to feed in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, even though I know the weekends, technically we've less pressures on our time, but 30 minutes at any time is quite a considerable chunk of time, whereas 5 minutes is, 5 minutes is much more manageable, I think, on a daily basis, personally. And God knows, I still find ridiculous reasons not to practice at times. My recent favorite was that I had to do some tax, so tax became the thing that I did instead, and that just shows you how much I didn't want to practice at that particular moment. But it was, I think just really trying to get across to them, you just sit and you do a small bit every day. And if that means that you do like 4 bars or something every day, it's just getting away from the piano and saying, I can do something that I couldn't do when I sat down to do this. Because
Mm.
that progression very, very quickly means that within 2 weeks, they can then play a piece or two
Yeah.
pieces, or they can just recognize, those notes. I know for the piano in particular, and actually I have to say, I've maybe a newfound respect for beginners this year, is, for the first few notes on a piano, they all look quite similar.
Yeah.
C, D, E, F. There's only small margins of difference between all of these notes, and it does take a lot of concentration. And music reading, because I think music is like a language. So to get proficient with reading it takes time. It takes time and it takes exposure. Uh, so you just have to kind of sit there and as I said, like, it's little and often. If you want to speak French, you try and read a bit of French or listen to French every day.
Yeah.
It's going to benefit you more. This is really just the same thing. And I suppose I just try and get that across, and just to try and give them reasons why these things are these things. So why is middle C middle C? How is middle C different to everything else? Just making sure that they know that piece of information, because
Mhm.
even if that's the only piece of information they know, at least that's a solid start, and you can build it from there.
Yeah.
I think.
I think one of the top tips that I would also really give parents, and picking up on the practicing at the weekend, which I think is really, it obviously is, that something that happens, but I would say the most important practice of the week is the practice that you do on the day of the lesson, straight after the lesson. I think if you can solidify that one in, even if it's just reading through the practice book, is going to make so much difference, because it's still fresh in your mind. And if you think, if you go through some of the conversations that you might have with your children, I've certainly had it with my students where I go, oh, what did you do today? And they can sort of maybe remember 2 things that they did, and it's kind of all slightly gone hazy. That is what happens with their music lesson. And they definitely don't remember. And I wouldn't expect them to. And I don't think any of our teachers do. That's why we write in a practice diary. But I think reading through that and trying to refresh those things is just such a good way to kind of reignite those little things and get that kind of little and often routine going. Okay, I think let's have some questions. Fiona, do we have any questions?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Actually, do you know what? The chat is incredibly empty at this precise moment in time. So I don't know if anybody wants to put something in or raise their hand, give us a wave, and ask any questions, or whether you've just been thoroughly comprehensive. All of those options are available, obviously.
All of those options. I'll tell you what, to kick it off, Fiona, I'll ask you, as a parent who's had children, still has children learning, but Fiona's eldest has learnt with me for many, many years, and she has a youngest that learns 2 instruments. How do you find supporting practice at home?
If I'm honest, it's a challenge, mainly because I have to put a lot of energy into it. There's no denying that. And so, for example, this week, this is not a sob story, but I have worked every evening. I've been on a call, or I've been in a webinar, or I've been doing some training. And so I have not actually seen either child after school this week, particularly, apart from to spend 20 minutes eating dinner with them. And so I'm well aware that there has been very little practice going on in this house. And Bethany, for example, plays 2 instruments that I know nothing about. I mean, I can hear the drums when something's in rhythm or not, but I don't have the foggiest. I can't get a noise out of the euphonium. And so understanding how she makes a noise out of it, and how she and how the actual instrument itself functions, and the marrying of air pressure with which fingers you put down on which valves, has been a real steep learning curve for both of us. But she is of an age, I mean, she's 10, she's in year 6, but if I don't sit with her, she won't practice. And I mean, I say that.
But having said that, they have made huge amounts of improvement because of
absolutely.
where they are.
exactly. And so for me, it comes in leaps and bounds. It's in fits and starts, I would say, rather than leaps and bounds. But when we do practice, there's an enormous improvement. And so I know that Bethany will sit, I mean, she'll be ready for her grade 5 next term. That's, you know, she is, when we work, it's amazing. And literally 5 minutes a night, there's an exponential, it has an exponential return, I think is probably what to say. And so, but it does require a lot of effort. And I have done ludicrous things in order to get my children to practice. But that, you know, so that everything from sticker charts to outright bribery, inventing dances to go with their pieces that I have to do while they perform them.
Inventing songs,
Inventing
yeah.
stories, inventing stories to go with their pieces, inventing songs to go with their pieces. I've done all of those things. And most of the time it's been deeply joyful, but my bear dance for grade 2 piano, I mean, still is an extraordinary memory that will live with all of us for quite a long time. But it does take effort. There's no denying that.
Yeah. Right. We've got some great questions.
Oh, we've got questions now.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll take the first one. So view on learning 2 instruments, that's really interesting. I think both Andy and I will say that we're advocates for it. I learnt 4 instruments as a child at the same time, and Andy is a multi-instrumentalist. Obviously that's quite extreme. That was what I did. So that was all my spare time. So that's a little bit different. But I think learning 2 instruments is incredibly valuable, especially having piano and something is very, very valuable. One of the great, as a violinist, that is my main instrument. That is what I perform on. But what makes me a rounded musician, a good teacher, and also able to just, you know, engage in another way is the fact that I have a lot of piano skills as well, and that my piano skills are as good, sometimes not as good as my violin, but I can use that as well. So I think learning 2 instruments is a really good thing, but obviously work out whether you can, you know, fit it in practice wise. I mean, I don't know what you'd say, Andy.
Yeah, I think sometimes it depends, I suppose, what standard you're at on both instruments. Yeah. I think when I started my second instrument, I was already at the grade 5 piano. So my music reading at that point was fairly competent. So I really was dealing with kind of learning the new challenges of the new instrument, as opposed to,
and that does make it easier, it's true. Yeah.
Which does make it a lot easier, in fairness. I think if you're kind of more in the infancy stages of both instruments, I think it's really important not to see music as opposing, so that the violin means it's this and the piano means it's this, because ultimately it's all the same thing. It's just that the vehicle of how it's expressed is different. So sometimes I do kind of, I hear people say, oh, on the guitar it is this, and I'm like, well, that's just music. It is, a C is a C, whether you're playing it on a guitar or whether you're playing it on a violin or playing it on a piano. It's a C is a C. Yeah. So I think that's probably the first thing. I don't know. I suppose, again, it really depends, I suppose, on what the pressures are on to do. So, for example, I suppose if you've got a violin exam next week and you've got, you know, you don't have piano, you know, does the piano take the back seat for a couple of days? Yeah. And like what you said earlier, that's totally reasonable. I think, you know,
as long as you explain it to the teacher, it's understood always.
Yeah. But it's like what you said earlier, you know, if you were practicing regularly on both your instruments and then suddenly, you know, something comes up like an exam. I mean, I had kids this week doing multiple exams in their other instruments. And so all of them started a lesson with, I haven't been able to do X, Y, and Z this week because I was preparing for my exam. It's like, okay, cool. And then we'll go through it again and we'll do it for this week, and it's absolutely fine. And it kind of just writes itself again the following week, you know, and we're back to kind of, you know, everything going. And it'll be the same when the piano exams come up, or their, you know, the piano performances come up as well. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's maybe, again, I think it's really just the same thing. I hope I'm kind of not glossing over the question really, but I think it's just, yeah, that encouragement and having that flexibility, you know, to prioritize, you know, depending on what needs the necessity at that at any given moment.
And always I think that just to finish that off, I feel like I'm a broken record when I say it, but always communicating. Your child will have the best lesson if you can just drop a really quick one-liner to the teacher to say, I'm really sorry, they're preparing for their violin exam, so piano has taken a back seat, and then the teacher's just so much more aware of the situation, and they're just going to take that into consideration, and there's just going to be no kind of quibbling about it. So I can see quite a lot of questions about encouraging. Am I right, Fiona? I don't know if I'm seeing everything.
No, yeah, you are, absolutely. That would be a good place. That would tick a lot of boxes. Go for it.
So I think encouraging practice, and children dead set against practice. I hear you, I know it, I understand it, and it can be really tough. A couple of things. I mean, reward charts are obviously a really great thing, and just starting it off really kind of slowly with, okay, let's try and get 3 done this week, and they get a sticker for everyone that they do, and if they get 10 stickers, then they get this treat, or etc., that on a small level. Or equally kind of involving the teacher in that, so saying, okay, so what are the things that they really enjoy or they get out of the lesson. So if there's a part of the lesson that they really enjoy with the teacher, maybe saying to the teacher, like, we're really struggling with practice and I really want to find ways to encourage him. Could you set them a goal? Could you say, if you practice 4 times this week, we'll do an extra bit of this exercise together. If they really like doing call and response, or they really love playing this piece with their teacher, or whatever that might be, then the teacher can also give them that reward and can also enforce that, oh, you've done 4 practices, that's absolutely amazing, that means we can move on to this bit and we can do this bit, and involving all 3 members of the musical triangle. I always think of what we do as a triangle, because everything depends on each other, and it's just so interwoven, teacher, parent, child. And that's the biggest piece of advice that I can give any parent, is that you are as equally essential as your child and your teacher in their musical progression. Without you being involved, this is so much less likely to thrive and grow. Even if you're slightly involved, it's going to have such better results. Have you got any other tips for sort of kind of encouraging, Andy? I mean, I know both of us have definitely had students that are completely kind of, it's a fight every time they practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reward system, I think, is the most better. I think it's the easiest one to definitely kind of see an improvement, because at least, again, if they see that their practice is being rewarded in some way, shape, or form, they will at least make themselves go and do it. Whether the practice is of the highest quality or not is not really the important thing. It's just making them kind of get there and just sit down and do it, I think sometimes is really what the battle is. I think from a teacher's perspective, I know because I work in St. Stephen's, with the house point system that's available to us, I give house points to the kids if they've done a particularly good week, or I think their concentration has been particularly good in a lesson, or I just think, and those small little rewards, I think, really mean quite a big thing. Again, it puts a positive spin on something that can sometimes feel a little bit of a challenge. And so I think I
think also, actually, interestingly, I've just spotted another question which I think keys into this, is you rewarding them by separating out sort of practice and just playing, because then just playing can be that reward, and kind of allowing your children to have the moment where they can, if they do their 10-minute practice, they can play whatever they like. They can play their favorite thing on the piano, or play their favorite song on the guitar, do whatever they want to do, as long as they've completed those 10 minutes or that 15 minutes of the things that was really structured, and those things don't creep in, then they can have that reward of playing whatever they like. I think separating out playing for the love of playing an instrument and practice is quite an important difference, because then you're going to get really good, really valuable practice, and you're going to encourage that love of just playing and just exploring some music and finding something that they love and they want to listen to and they want to do. That can be a really, really positive way to show them the benefits of practice as well, and reward that.
I have somebody at the minute, just as a random kind of example, I think kind of similar to this, who kind of she really enjoys playing, but the practice, again, I don't think she always enjoys practicing, but she really enjoys playing, and she likes making up her own little tunes. So she comes into me kind of, you know, every couple of weeks and says, I've written a new tune. Can I play you my new tune, or can I play you my new melody? And that, and I'm always like, well, show me what you've practiced. And then in the last 5 minutes of our lesson, of course, I'll listen to whatever it is. And, you know, she'll sit and play whatever it is that she's written. And sometimes I have to say, I mean, to her credit, the stuff is very, very good. It's great. And it has got, because she does it so much, it's got better and better and better. And obviously, as her skill with the piano gets better and her facility gets better, actually her compositions get better, and the stuff that she's able to do gets better and better. And it's kind of nice, because she obviously gets a personal reward out of that, because she likes being able to just play things, which I think comes up a lot. I'm not sure if it's come up as a question or not, but this idea of kind of, you know, when kids start, can they play for fun? You know, that's, I think, one that's a really big one that actually I don't think we've necessarily touched on specifically, as I want them to play music for fun. I know in Ireland this is a big thing, you know, because music is part of the community. Like, you know, people play at sessions and trad sessions and things like that. So it's part of a community, you know, everyone kind of turns up and you can bring whatever, you know, we've got guitars or whistles or flutes or bowrons or whatever, and people will just give it a lash. And it doesn't make a difference whether you get it right or wrong. It's just a kind of a community, an atmosphere. And the thing about it is, you know, I think that it is important that kids enjoy it, of course, but you always have to think, do you enjoy doing something that you don't really feel you're massively good at or don't have a great facility with? I used to think with, like, sport is a great example of this. Kids who, I mean, I hated football growing up. I've never been a big football, soccer fan at all, because I wasn't very good at it. And because I wasn't good at it, I didn't particularly enjoy it. And because I didn't enjoy it, I didn't really want to work on it. And it kind of fed into itself. If I had worked at it a bit more, had I played a bit more, which I then started as a teenager, I actually realized it wasn't as bad as I thought at it. And then I suddenly started to enjoy it a bit more because I was better at it. So it's kind of, I think that's something just to kind of keep in mind as well, is that I think, you know, playing, even though I think it's an altruistic ideal that kids will play for fun, to get to that level where you can just play for fun does take time and does take hard work. Sorry.
It definitely takes a while. It takes a while, but then it pays off in dividends. And again, you know, I know Fiona will agree with me. Her eldest has taken her grade 8 violin, and she plays her viola, but she can just pick up her violin and play what she wants, and pick up a piece and do it for, you know, a therapeutic thing as well. And that was all those years of learning but now she has a skill that she will never ever forget. Doesn't matter if she doesn't pick it up for 2 months, she won't forget how to play the violin. And it provides that now for fun, but it's hard to do it just for fun right in the very early stages. Fiona, any other questions? I've lost the chat. I'm conscious we've only got about 8 more minutes, so
how careless of you. I think we've probably talked about most of the practicing questions and about encouraging kids, which are most of them. There's just one that we haven't touched on, which is about, I don't know whether, which is about supporting very, very early stages. So Anna's asking, her child is only 3 or 4 weeks in. Anna, I don't know what instrument your child plays.
Yeah.
But if I remember
from my spidey senses, I think it's piano, because
I see piano, yeah.
Okay, I see certain applications come up and I remember it. I have a very strange brain for that. Yeah, piano. Well, I guess I'll probably give this over to Andy, but I mean, probably the little and often, but Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just the way I think the things that you said in this is the crucial thing. Is one, make it part of a routine that they do. I have, of the people I think that have been the most successful in the last few years, they have a specific time that they sit down and do it every day, and it just becomes part of that routine, to the point where you might have to fight it for the first couple of weeks because it's a new thing. And but once, after about 2 weeks, it just becomes, all right, well, I sit down at 4 o'clock or 4:05, and I do from 4:05 to 4:15, I play the piano or whatever it might be. I go home, I drink a juice, and then I sit down and I do my piano or whatever. I think that's it. And then also not doing too much. I think this is really important when you start out, is not to, when I write down in a red book, ironically, the more practice kids do, the more I have to write in the red book. If I only write 1 or 2 lines, or like very, very short things, it can be either because they've started a new piece and they don't need necessarily specific things that they have to work on in terms of bars. But I might give a beginner 2 or 3 little small exercises to go through. I don't expect that they will sit down and play those 2 or 3 exercises every day. In fact, I don't even expect that they will play through one of those exercises in one day. That, if it's 8 bars long, they might just do the first half of that in one sitting. And that'll be great, because if they can recognize, it takes time to work out the notes, it takes time to work out the rhythm. They have to, I encourage people to clap their pieces and name their notes before they even try and play it. So it takes time, so I don't think, just try not to do too much, because I think you reach saturation point pretty quickly, especially as a new person. It's just too much information. I think you get a bit of an overload.
Good tip that my mother used to do, actually, and I still do with my beginners, is setting out, let's say, 6 tasks. If you can split it into, and you can always kind of pretend that some aren't being doubled up. I mean, you can do some which is like clap the rhythm or play this thing. If you can find 6 little tasks, get a dice and make it into a game. So you roll the dice and they just do 2 of them. You roll a 1, or they do task 1, and you roll a 3 and they do task 3, and that's their practice. And it becomes a game for really young ones. Is really a really kind of great way to kind of make it fun. But also, again, if you can spare it, especially with the really young ones, I think just sitting with them for that 5 minutes and doing it alongside them it becomes that quality time that they have with you as well, which is, and they're just more engaged in, even if they're just reading it through and they play it, as we say, that little bit of having that time with you. And if you can make it into a game, will definitely help.
Also, just one other thing that I would, as an observation, say is that if you don't know anything about the instrument, one way to reinforce their learning is to get them to teach you. So, if they're learning how to do a scale for the first time, and I have played some pretty appalling violin scales in the last 5 years, but I never played the violin before. So that's an achievement for me, but also they taught it to me. So that makes the big difference, because it's just reinforcing their learning as well. Right, we probably are running out of time, but there are 2 questions that are not necessarily linked to this, but ideal age to start playing an instrument.
Very interesting question. I think the younger the better, but that's my own opinion. I started when I was 4. I started the violin when I was 4, and the piano when I was 5. But again, with really young ones, you have to be there. And I would really encourage that if you are going to start an instrument young, definitely make sure that you're going to be able to be part of that learning process, because they're so young at that point. But the younger they learn, I'll come on to certain instruments, but the younger you start, the less they're going to remember. So as in, what's the best way of putting it? I don't remember starting the violin, so I don't remember the painful part. So I only really remember being able to play the violin, which means that actually all my memories are positive ones. And I have that. I've had that with a lot of my students that have started in reception, is that actually all they can remember is being good, because actually their memories kick in when they're performing in a concert and playing and everyone's applauding, and they don't remember when it was scratchy and squeaky and all those types of things. So I think that's really positive. Piano, you have to, the reason we do it from year 1 is a size thing, and we have to cut it at that age. You have to really have a certain amount of size. String instruments can be from reception, because you can get teeny tiny little instruments. Brass instruments, you need to have your 2 front teeth, and woodwind instruments, I believe, are the same. So that's why it's year 2, because in general, most children are kind of around that point, but otherwise we might delay it for a bit, etc. Does that sort of cover that, Fiona?
Yep, brilliant. And then now Kenneth's asked the $1 million question here, and I'm expecting a full out punch up. What's the best instrument to start with?
Obviously the violin.
Well, that's a lie. It's an absolute lie.
I genuinely would say, okay, so I do think piano is a really good instrument to start with. However, I'm going to read. Yeah, I'm recording it. All right. However, obviously, piano is super overbooked in many places as well. String instruments are a really good starter, especially if you're starting in reception, because they are so small and they're fitted to the size. And also, I really encourage, it comes back to the point of doing 2 instruments. The reason I encourage children to learn another instruments aside from piano is because most of the other instruments are ensemble instruments and they can play them with other people. And there comes a lot of joy from music, is playing it with other children and being able to be part of an orchestra, being part of a quartet. If you play the piano, it's really great, instantly tactile, but you're really unlikely to be playing in an orchestra or anything like that. So having that as a skill to learning is really great, but I would really encourage other instruments. If you're going to start in reception, you're going to obviously probably choose. So I would choose violin or cello. I really love the cello. I wish I'd learned the cello. But if they're a bit older and they're learning, so for woodwind and brass instruments, if you're not sure, so for instance, if they've started piano, let's say in year 1, and they're playing, and you want them to learn a second instrument, you're around year 3, play them a load of instruments, play them wind instruments, brass instruments, all those things, so that they kind of hear it and then can pick it themselves. And then I think that's a really, really positive thing. I would say with strings, the later you start, the harder it is. Strings are super, super competitive. And when it comes to, I don't think it's right for me to kind of pretend that it's not like that. It is. And the earlier you start with these things, the easier it's going to be. Equally, Andy, probably on a point of, yeah, carry on.
just on a one point, just where I think piano kind of does stand aside on its own a little bit, is just in terms of general musicianship. Because piano, you learn both treble clef and bass clef from day 1. It means when you do want to branch out into that second instrument, you are kind of at an advantage over somebody who's only learned a single. So, for example, as a violinist, if you've learned how to play treble clef and you decide, I don't know, I've had a longing to play the bassoon since I was 8, have to overcome the hurdle of learning to read bass clef and then learning the instrument itself. So, there is a nice thing. Now it shouldn't be, depending on how far down the line you are when you decide to get onto the bassoon or whatever it happens to be. It mightn't be hugely problematic, but it can be just another obstacle to overcome. So I do think that the piano does have that kind of going for it in terms of general musicianship. You're covering a lot of bases there. So that if you decide to go off into another instrument or to do that second instrument study, you're kind of starting at a kind of a good, with a kind of a foot forward as such.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think that's kind of all we have time for. I know that I did see that there was a question about grades. I'd really encourage you to go and listen to the webinar that we did, because we don't currently have time to go through all the grade questions. But if you go listen to the webinar on exams, we had an examiner in talking about those things. So that will be super helpful. And if you go on the website, you will also see the notes from that as well. So all there is to say is thank you so much for joining us. Please do join us again next month. We're trying to keep these super informative, super interesting. Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us. Thank you, Fiona, for managing the chats. I hope that was useful. If you do, we record everything, we put them on the website, as I say. So if you do want to come back and revisit it, check it out in a few days and it will be up there. Obviously, it's not going to be completely immediate, but yeah, thank you so much for coming and have a lovely night.